Dear friends, hello and welcome to our weekly philosophical talks with S.Friedman. First of all, we'd like to thank and welcome our amazing speaker, S.Friedman, today. Thank you very much, Stephen, for joining us weekly on these great philosophical talks on Fridays. Also, we would like to give thanks to the U.S. Consulate General here in Almaty, American Space Almaty, and also you, our friends, for joining us weekly. Please feel free to ask your questions, to give your feedback, and join our philosophical talks next Friday as well. The topic for today's talks is the philosophy of winning. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aaliyah, for the introduction and for moderating these talks, facilitating them. I also want to thank the U.S. Consul General in Almaty, Dana, Elmira, and everyone involved in making these weekly talks possible, providing a platform, an unusual platform in the contemporary world for philosophy and philosophical viewpoints on a wide range of I hope, compelling issues that often correspond to international days of celebration, commemorations, or more general philosophical issues that affect everyone in one way or another. Tonight's talk, well, again, I say tonight because I'm speaking from Los Angeles. It's evening. Today's talk, as you're experiencing it in Kazakhstan and that portion of the world, is about the philosophy of winning. When I first thought of this topic, and I like to always give an indication as to how some of the ideas that are central to the talk develop, how they germinate, how they cohere. When I first thought of the topic, what immediately entered my mind was a quotation by Cervantes, the great 16th century Spanish writer, novelist, author of Don Quixote, considered by many scholars the first modern novel, universally ranked as one of the greatest works of literature, one of the greatest works of artistic creation, of any culture. The line, the quotation that came to my mind was Cervantes' comment, "Comparisons are odious, hateful, repugnant, not acceptable, wrong-headed. Comparisons are fundamentally wrong in some way." It's germane to this topic, the topic of winning, because winning is a mode of comparison. It's a comparative evaluation. We talk about winning and losing. We are comparing outcomes. We're comparing outcomes of two competitors engaged in some common enterprise, some type of conflict. That Cervantes would make that type of remark is of particular interest since his great work, Don Quixote, is one of the greatest testaments to failure, to the inability to win, at least by society standards. It's also a testament to the power of delusion, that even though Don Quixote, the main character, is constantly defeated, is constantly engaging in futile endeavors, futile efforts, futile combats to win the hand of Dulcinea, his dream ideal, in a work that represents a celebration of a lost age, the age of the knight errant. It was a kind of sort of valedictory, a farewell to that epoch, of the Middle Ages. Well, it's a comic novel because of Don Quixote's illusions, his delusions about what he's doing. Every time he fails, it's not quite a failure. Every time he tries to contend with windmills and is horribly defeated, well, he's not defeated in spirit. But nevertheless, the novel is a string of failures, a string of defeats. The relationship between, actually, there are a couple of other aspects of Don Quixote that I should point to in this context to broaden the perspective. In addition to thinking of that quotation, comparisons are odious, which again is relevant to this topic because winning is a mode of comparison. I think of an essay by John Barryman, the 20th century American poet and literary critic. I especially esteem his literary criticism, for which he's sometimes called one of the most intelligent Americans of the time, of the age. His poetry I don't find quite so compelling. I don't think it has endured to the degree that his literary criticism has, at least in my estimation, continued to represent a vibrancy of mind. He forged a style that was probably the single most important influence upon my style of writing prose. Not so much my aphoristic style of writing philosophy, even though a lot of his essays contain significant aphoristic formulations. For example, there's an essay that he wrote on Don Quixote. And the essay begins with a sentence that I find among the most compelling sentences I've read. He's framing the work, and he's framing the essay, and he's framing it in reference to the works of Dante, Shakespeare, and Cervantes that he considers to represent the apex of Western literary achievement. And he writes, to begin this essay, Dantesca, Shakespearean, Cervantina. The words point to worlds, majestic worlds, worlds of extraordinary literary ambition and vision. Well, he concludes the essay by inquiring into the subject of Don Quixote, the subject of this work that is a testament to failure, or a testament to delusion in the face of failure. And he writes, and I'm not going to quote this verbatim, but I'm going to kind of paraphrase it. He writes that it's a curious thing that of great works of art, it doesn't much signify what the subject is. That it's the power of mind, depth of imagination, greatness of spirit, breadth of experience that makes or not the work. But he goes on to emphasize that in the case of Don Quixote, the subject does matter, because the subject of that work is freedom. And as Berryman continues, and this I quote, freedom is the topic of every work of art of which I have any knowledge, he writes. It's a matter of freedom. The title of the essay on Don Quixote is The Freedom of the Dawn, not the delusions or the failures, but the freedom of the dawn and of Don Quixote. That essay appears in a collection of essays by Berryman titled The Freedom of the Poet. So we have this juxtaposition of this concept of comparisons being odious that applies to Don Quixote, and also of the topic of freedom. Well, it turns out the way we can understand this philosophically, deeply, comparisons are convergences. Comparisons operate within, therefore, convergent heuristic space. Heuristic space is a space of convergences that also function as constraints. The alternative to heuristic space is epistemic space. That's a divergent space. That's the space characterized fundamentally by a rigorous freedom. So when we're talking about winning, and we're talking about the comparisons that support the evaluations, we're talking within a constrained space, a space that's not fundamentally free, and that's not fundamentally in the direction of our ultimate interests that epistemic space, rigorous space, achieves. Now, I want to say something about the origination of this concept of convergent space, heuristic space. I've alluded to it a lot, and it obviously frames much of these discussions, these weekly talks. But I haven't quite given its genesis, like exactly the sort of the ideas as they progressed to lead to something that for me is as comprehensive as epistemic and heuristic characterizations. And as a prelude to that, I want to share you something. Last week I talked about how some of my pole art, some of the art you see behind me, actually contains transliterations of aphorisms into Braille, right? And I showed you that, for example, if you can see over here, Braille configures letters in terms of an arrangement of 6 dots or spaces. In this case, we have dot, dot, the 2 black dots, and then a space, a space, a space, a space, 6 things with 2 black dots filled in. That's the letter B, okay, in Braille. Well, here's a series of polls that constitutes, well, a transliteration of 2 aphorisms that summarize what I was just saying and summarize what I want to explain in a little bit more detail in relation to this concept of winning. Let me show you. Now, I haven't sent this to Aaliyah, so let me just... Okay, here's a close-up of the poll work. Now, if you count it, you would see there are 12 polls. There's always an even number of polls because in each 2 adjacent polls, I transcribe the Braille letters, okay? Now, these 12 polls contain 2 aphorisms. The first 6 polls contain the aphorism, heuristics converge to constrain. The next 6 polls contain epistemics diverge to transcend. That is a complete summary of the logic of epistemic and heuristic spaces. It's very concentrated. It's actually a summary of my philosophical work in that one can get to the 20,000 aphorisms, let's say, that I've written by linking them all, each individually, to those 2 particular aphorisms. But that's, of course, how the aphorisms function, that from any aphorism, one can get to the others, right? I've written an aphorism in a convergent space all roads lead to Rome. So all of these aphorisms interconnect when it's a matter of understanding the philosophical work, because we're understanding it from the outside. We're understanding it not from within epistemic space, within that rigorous representation. We're understanding it heuristically in terms of our language from the outside of the epistemic space. And from that outside, everything is coming together. And so we can start wherever we like with any given aphorism and get to all of the others. Now, in terms of where that concept of convergence comes from, when I was first doing philosophy, I was interested in coming to terms with the Socratic orientation. We can know nothing, right? Socrates was called the wisest of all men because he knew that he knew nothing. Well, question is, what exactly is the status of that claim? When he says we know nothing, can we support that rigorously? And is that really a path to the deepest wisdom? Or is it just a failure to come to terms with everything that we can in fact know? Well, my first approach to that was through David Hume, the 18th century English philosopher who argued convincingly, probably the single most important result of modern philosophy: the past can't guarantee the future, right? No matter what our anticipations are, the future can differ, the future can thwart those expectations. There's nothing inherent in the past that places a logical net over the future and guarantees a certain course of events. And that's true whether you embrace philosophy. It's true if you embrace the concept of divinity. God has the power to decide that the future will differ from the past. If you embrace science, physics, statistical mechanics, the laws of science are just generalizations of past experience. There's no guarantee that they have to apply into the future. If you believe in statistical mechanics, well, that says that the course of events is ultimately a matter of probability, that this table in front of me or this chair can rocket into space if all of its atoms happen one moment to align upwards. The fact that they don't is just a matter of probability. It's unlikely that they will, but not impossible. So past can't guarantee the future. But we still can have ideas, knowledge about the future, seemingly. So how does that Socratic proposition relate to our understanding of claims about the past, claims of what we think we are based upon past experience? Well, that's where that second proposition that I've often discussed, the future decides the past, comes in. And the best way to illustrate that, it's really a comment about the nature of how concepts work. And so it owes a little bit to the work of Wittgenstein, that words are not labels. They function in terms of facilitating a form of life, but they can't, again, impose a logical net over the future, intrinsically constrain it. But the best way to understand the implications, as I've talked in the past, is the question of, is this world real or dream? Well, if one day we awaken to a totally different reality that persists, this was dream. Our sense of the definiteness, the incontestability of past experience, of our knowledge of the past, is simply a reflection of our not imagining that the future can take sufficiently radically different directions. And there's no intrinsic, inherent guarantee against that happening. So those two propositions together, past can't guarantee the future decides the past, can help explain and put on a rigorous footing what Socrates was asserting. aphoristically. It's not to say that we know nothing. We know those propositions, for example. And knowing those propositions is not knowing nothing. It's knowing something significant about the world, about the nature of experience, about the nature of our concepts in relation to experience. But it provides a basis for liberating us from the shackles of the past, the burdens of what we presume about the world. We can always free ourselves from those presumptions through those two propositions. Then I was considering another direction, to establishing a rigorous support for that Socratic position. And that became an investigation of the nature of science. And the foundation of science, its rigor, is in the controlled experiment. But when you're dealing with controlled experiments, you have to be able to eliminate all the differences between the two things that you're experimenting with, right? So that, if you're dealing with investigating the effectiveness of a possible cancer drug, you take one person with the cancer, one person with the cancer, and give them different, in one case you give the person a drug that you're investigating, the other case you give the person a placebo, sugar pill, something that simulates the experience of taking a drug, but doesn't have any active mechanism within it. Well, those two people, they'll have to be identical. Otherwise, any difference in the outcome of the experiment can be due to any differences between those two people, and not necessarily the fact that one has gotten the drug and the other hasn't. So what I began to investigate was, what's the possibility of completely eliminating that what's called confounding variable, or a set of confounding variables? Can we make these two individuals or these two experimental situations absolutely identical? Well, to do that, I began eliminating things from the picture. So I started to imagine not two individuals, not two identical twins, but two points, two mathematical points without any properties. And then I imagined them against a blank background, against empty space, against nothing. And I thought, okay, now we've distilled this experimental situation to its absolute, we've eliminated everything from it except the essential ingredients of the two objects, the experimental and the control. Have we eliminated all possible confounding variables? And so that whatever we do to one, like give one a drug, we can attribute any difference in the outcome of the experiment to that intervention, to that drug. And if you think about it, no, because these 2 points are still two distinguishable points. Whatever makes them different means that whatever difference there is in the outcome of the experiment can be attributed to the fact that these were not 1 point, but two. One was to the left of the other. That difference might have been decisive. It doesn't matter what the difference is. All that matters is we can distinguish them. And whatever is the basis for distinguishing those 2 points becomes the confounding variable. So that represented a rigorous assessment of the situation. And that then constituted the rigor of the experimental investigation, that so long as these 2 points are distinguishable at all, so long as they are 2 and not 1, whatever applies to one need not apply to the other. So that led to the realization that a rigorous space is a difference space. A rigorous space is a space in which one thing is distinguishable from something else for whatever reason. When we're doing our science, we are overlooking those distinctions. We're overlooking that difference in position. And we're just kind of imagining these 2 points that are distinguishable are, for the purpose of the experiment, not distinguishable in any fundamental way. That's not rigorous. That's the space in which we can carry out the experiment to achieve some goal, some result that may be useful to us. That becomes the basis for me for heuristic space. So whatever distinguishes 2 points is the basis of the epistemic, the basis of rigor. Rigor is of difference. Whatever allows us to group these points together becomes the basis for, well, the basis for conceptualizations, where things are grouped based on certain types of resemblances. Wittgenstein called them family resemblances. So, a rigorous space, an epistemic space, is a divergent space, a space in which comparisons are not intrinsically possible. A heuristic space, a conceptual space, is a space in which we group things together for some purpose or other. A space in which we cluster things for some purpose or other. Concepts cluster things for some purpose or other. The concept of dog or house or chair clusters all such similar things that are similar in some set of ways for some purpose or other, but approximately, not rigorously. When we're talking about winning and making comparisons, one of the assessments of winning is in terms of number, right? That we, in sports, we keep score. In elections, we tally results. Numbers, help us decide, like, an outcome, help us decide a verdict, help us decide a verdict in a courtroom. The number of votes, the number of runs scored. Number is central to many of our assessments of winning. Not all, but many. It's central, to a lot of our thinking when it comes to that type of appraisal. Well, why number? What does number signify? The philosopher Bertrand Russell, 20th century philosopher, wrote in the introduction to his autobiography, the book that I read when I was young. I was about 13. I just started reading philosophy the year before. I'd started reading Alfred North Whitehead. Turns out Russell worked with Alfred North Whitehead at Cambridge, early part of the 20th century, on this major work of mathematics and mathematical logic called Principia Mathematica. Well, so Bertrand Russell was a philosopher, but also a mathematician of significant reputation, stature. He wrote in the introduction to his autobiography that he wanted to understand the Pythagorean power by which numbers held sway over the flux, over a changing world, the power of number to make precise, our sense of nature's repetitions in laws of nature. He was referencing Pythagoras. Pythagoras was an early Greek mathematician who had written, "All is number." So there's the inspiration for that orientation on the part of Bertrand Russell. Well, what does that mean? Why would Pythagoras, an eminent mathematician and thinker who actually Newton thought had discovered all of the results that Newton had arrived at? They had just been lost in Newton's estimation. So he looked back at Pythagoras as the greater mind, the representing the greater understanding. Well, if you look around, you see objects, you see things that are familiar, you see things that can be named or described: tables, chairs, poles, walls, floors, people that can be named, people that can be described. What you are seeing is heuristic space. You're seeing a convergent space. In order to see the epistemic space around us, you would have to see everything as new and strange. You would have to see everything as if you were seeing it with eyes that were open to the world for the very first time, where there was no sense of pattern, no sense of past, no sense of expectation. That's a rigorous space, an epistemic space. That's the fundamental reality. What we're seeing as we look around and see familiar things is the past that we then project into the future in our expectations for how these objects are going to behave. That's what the mind does. It simplifies. Heuristic space is a simplification. Well, the reason so when we look around, we're seeing heuristic space. That's a convergent space. That's the definition of heuristic space, right? That epistemic space is divergent, what distinguishes 2 points. Heuristic space is convergent, what they have in common, how they group together. Well, numbers represent the fundamental grouping of objects independent of the type of thing that we're grouping. But notice, numbers represent fundamental elemental convergences, right? An object is bounded, has boundaries. The boundaries can be thought of as, well, 2 things coming together to form a boundary. That's a convergence. Boundaries are convergences. The objects you see around you are bounded. They're a product of convergences. In addition, though, to objects being convergent structures, if we group objects together, that's a convergent process, right? If we group 2 things together, or 3 things, or 4 things, or 5 things, grouping things together according to what? The number of those things is a fundamental process in a convergent space. So the reason that we are seeing a world in which all is number is because we are experiencing heuristic, which is convergent space, and numbers are elemental forms of convergence. See? So it's a constraining space, right? It's a space in which things are coming together, a space in which we are sort of, we're convergent with the space. Our experience is a matter of our new experiences represent encounters with new sensations. Encounters are convergences. Memories are convergent structures. Whatever we are experiencing can be understood in terms of that fundamental concept. Numbers represent the fundamental clustering or grouping, again, of elements of heuristic space independent of what the other characteristics of those objects are, right? If we are grouping 3 things together, It doesn't matter whether those three things are, one is a pencil, one's a pen, one's an elephant. It doesn't matter. It matters that there are three such things. And the fact that there are 3 or 4 or 5 represent a clustering. And a clustering is a convergence. And a convergence is the fundamental characteristic of the space that we see. So, it's not surprising that we should be thinking in terms of numbers when we're dealing with aspects of winning or losing, because winning is a convergent comparative process itself, and comparisons and convergences are assessed or can be assessed by number. Now, let's look at some examples. In the case of one of the fundamental examples where we talk about winning is in sports. And a competition, like a basketball game, a tennis match, is a series of binary engagements, encounters. Like one competitor hits the ball, the other competitor returns it. Those are convergences. Right? Those convergences play out in such a way that each one, in the course of a competition, a match, a game, can be summarized by a score. So we have an engagement. There is a test, a criterion of what constitutes winning that engagement, right? In the case of tennis, the US Open is being contested right now in New York. If the ball that's hit is not hit back, right, within certain parameters, within the court, or not hit back, before it bounces twice, or hit into the net, then that counts as 1 point for the opponent. So we're able to keep track of these serial encounters, like one engagement after another, one game after another, one inning after another, by a score. And then we sum those scores up to a final result that achieves a verdict for that overall competition, which is what? A convergent phenomenon, right? When we're talking about two people, two opponents, we're talking about two people engaged in some type of convergent process. And depending upon the nature of the game, the nature of the competition, each one of these engagements has an outcome that can be assigned a value, a verdict, a score. And so a game, a competition, a tennis match is actually a series of convergent encounters. Each one is capable of being given a numerical value, and then the overall engagement, the overall competition, the overall game sums to a given result. And depending upon how that result sums, we get a victor. We get somebody that wins. The competition has to be bounded in some way. It's really a type of decision-making process that we're engaged in. One of the things about decision-making processes that I talked about previously is that so long as the process continues, the verdict is never definitive, right? So if we want a definitive verdict, a definitive winner, we have to bring the process to an end. Well, most commonly or often that's done by means of a clock, right? Lots of encounters, lots of games, lots of competitions are timed. When time runs out, whatever the verdict is, whatever the sum of the serial convergences, the encounters of the two opponents, that gives the verdict. Sometimes we don't have things that are timed, but they tend to play out not within an infinite span of time, even though that might be theoretically possible, right? There have been tennis matches that have gone on for, well, several days, but it's rare. If it happened commonly, we'd have to introduce some of the means of bringing the competition to an end. One of the things that's fundamental in the assessment of winning is to bring the interaction to an end so that we can achieve a sum that is complete for the engagement. It's one of the characteristics of, again, convergent space, right? Convergent space tends to be, it's a bounded space. By nature, objects are bounded. And so within convergent spaces, we move towards bounded or engage in bounded phenomena. Our concepts bound things. Epistemic space is the opposite. We'll address that more towards the end of the talk. We see a similar thing, well, in terms of like numerical assessments, that's what voting is doing, right? In the case of voting, the weight of each individual ballot cast is the same, right? What matters is that we sum the results, and whichever has the greater sum, that represents the greater, really, convergence in terms of the number of people supporting one particular candidate. So the greater the number, and that's one general way that I've discussed in the past, we engage in decision-making in heuristic space. We go in the direction of the greater number of convergences. The greater number of convergences represents the greater number of votes cast for a given candidate. That constitutes winning for that candidate. Again, the concept of winning is playing itself out in heuristic space, in convergent space, and so it's a matter of numbers of magnitude of convergence that decides the outcome. In some athletic competitions, things are not scored like winning and losing in an engagement, like hitting a ball back and forth over a net, and whoever fails to return it doesn't get the point. Like the last one who successfully returned the ball within bounds does. And we sum those, and the result at the end of the match is the greater number of convergences, right? The greater number of successes. In the case of certain sports like gymnastics or figure skating, it's not a matter of a competition, an engagement, between two boxers, two tennis players. It's a matter of evaluation based upon certain aspects of form that's exhibited, right? The form of the skater, the form of the gymnastic maneuvers, the complexity of the gymnastic maneuvers, and the degree to which they were successfully achieved. Well, form is an ordering that represents a mode of convergence. You're bringing things together in a certain way, certain angles and certain patterns. That an ordering is an aspect of convergent structures. We can bring things together just in terms of numbers, like a group of marbles, just kind of bring them together. Or we can bring a certain number of marbles together, a greater or lesser number of marbles, and order them in some way. The ordering itself becomes a convergent element. When I talk about convergences, in other words, I'm talking about very general features. I'm not talking about just like atoms or molecules that are coming together, not just physical objects. I'm talking at the highest level of generality, short of the generality of philosophic rigor. And so I'm talking about anything that's brought together. That can be the order of things, that can be an idea that's added, that can be a pause that's introduced. Anything that's brought together is an object that represents a convergent element at, again, a high level of generality. In the case of legal decisions, legal verdicts, winning and losing, is central, to our encounter with that process, those institutions. One thing to keep in mind, when we are making decisions, within a legal context, if it's a civil case where adjudicating, we're making decisions, the jury is evaluating, making decisions based on what's called a preponderance of the evidence, right? The greater the weight of evidence, towards one of the two people engaged in the conflict, well, that's the one who wins the conflict, right? Who gets the judgment. We go again in the direction of the greater convergence, but it's not a precise notion, right? It's not just a matter of adding up equivalent elements when, as it is, let's say, when we're counting votes in an election. Different elements that we're adding up in the case of evidence for or against have different weights. Right? We might, in some case, be attending to the testimony of witnesses, and certain witnesses might carry greater weight, greater authority, greater reliability, greater power to convince. So they will have a greater sort of bearing upon the overall verdict that's achieved, right? We will go in the direction of not just the greater number of people that are testifying to a certain claim. We're also influenced by the authority that each individual bears. The greater the weight of authority, the more that matters in terms of influencing the outcome. So it's not a precise process. In the case of a criminal case, the standard is beyond a reasonable doubt. We want the evidence, which, again, we marshal evidence. We consider evidence of guilt. What is the process of evaluating and finding and assembling evidence? It's a convergent process. If that weight of evidence is sufficient, if the convergence is strong enough, robust enough, we get a conviction, right? But the standard of conviction is what? Beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, that's an imprecise term. It's meant to be imprecise. Philosophy has a very specific relationship to that notion of reasonable doubt. Philosophy's standard is the incontrovertible, beyond all possible doubt. So from that philosophical standpoint, just as preponderance of evidence is vague, so reasonable doubt is inherently vague. One can, from a philosophical standpoint, always find doubt and always find sufficient doubt for philosophical purposes. But so we're not dealing in a legal setting with rigor, right? And we're not dealing with incontrovertible results and outcomes. We've seen there have been famous cases The O.J. Simpson case some years ago, that famous American football player who was accused of the murder of two people, was a case where there was seemingly a mountain of evidence, an irrefutable mountain of evidence of guilt. But O.J. Simpson's attorneys found sufficient issues to raise sufficient doubt in enough jurors that O.J. Simpson was not convicted. So I've made the point I've referred in the past to the work of Quine, philosopher at Harvard, who wrote about how any set of situations is capable of being explained in an infinite number of ways. So we can always find alternative explanations, alternative scenarios for any situation. And if we're sufficiently persuasive in presenting some of these alternatives, that can raise doubt in a juror's mind about the case that the prosecution is presenting, the picture of how the prosecution is connecting the dots, how the prosecution is imagining the evidence to cohere and form a claim of guilt or induce to guilt. Well, so we're not within a legal context addressing issues of incontrovertibility. It's a matter of what a juror finds persuasive, what a juror finds beyond a reasonable doubt, and each juror might have a different sense of that. And all that matters is, like in the case of a murder conviction, do all of the jurors agree that the evidence presented was capable of establishing guilt beyond that reasonable doubt? Okay? Not, again, to a level of an incontestable rigor. That's one way that verdicts are achieved. It's not a matter of, again, of achieving a rigorous result, a result where we absolutely know beyond all possible doubt that this person is guilty, right? That's not the ambition. It's to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt so that we're reasonably satisfied with the verdict and we bring the process to an end. So we are not spending the rest of our lives in that courtroom evaluating the evidence and adjudicating that case. That's something central to the whole judicial system that relates to this notion of winning involves truncating, bringing things to a termination within convergent space, which is a bounded space where truncation endings are natural sort of processes, natural events. In the case of the broader legal system, most countries have a Supreme Court. A Supreme Court is making decisions based upon laws that are instituted with a sense of fairness, a sense of justice. But the ultimate point of that judicial process, the appeals process that finally terminates in a Supreme Court whose judgment is decisive no matter what, at least that day, that hour, is it brings the process to an end. We can get a winner when we can end the process. As opposed to that story that I've told about the Zen master and the 14-year-old boy, where each new event presents a new evaluation and a reversal of evaluation. We're never going to be able to declare a winner in that case if the events continue to unfold. Termination is essential because, again, this concept of winning is playing out within a bounded, a convergent, a constrained space. In art, we're not dealing with numerical evaluation, typically, right? But there are modes of comparison that are taking place that are decisive in our sense of success. Certainly, and I don't mean success in terms of the value that a work might bring at an auction, but success in terms of the aesthetic evaluation, especially of the artist, him or herself. Goethe once said, in art, the best is good enough. That implies a comparative process. Art's often been the object of competitions, going and evaluations. We have, movies evaluated, in varieties of formats and settings. We have, from the time of ancient Greece, competitions among plays and playwrights. And it's a matter of what? It's a convergent process. We're comparing, we're bringing the two things together and evaluating them and seeing which one is preeminent in some way, which one wins, which one has really the greater, which one is more robust, which one is, we can put it in convergent terms, which is the more powerful, the more convergent result. But in the case of works of art, there's a famous remark. Toulouse-Lautrec, a 19th century post-impressionist painter, once, let me show you an example of his work. There is an example of a Toulouse-Lautrec. Something in the nature of a sketch. It's a finished work, a finished painting, but it has a sketchwork quality to it. Impressionist works, in general, had the character of a sketch, right? Not the kind of high finish, that you associate with earlier Renaissance works, for example. Well, Toulouse-Lautrec famously remarked once, any idiot can finish a painting. Well, actually, finishing a painting is the most difficult aspect of the work. I know this from my own experience, where you can bring a work almost to completion and then ruin it with a final application, a final stroke. It was often the case with Picasso. He would be working on something, take it in a different direction, and have to repaint the entire work. So finishing works is a challenge. And someone like Mondrian, let me show you an example of a Mondrian. It's called a non-objective painting. It's not an abstraction. He's trying to represent a kind of Platonic reality beneath the surface of things. Well, Mondrian remarked after each work, and he painted in that mode for about 27 years. Do one work with extreme deliberation, come to the end of it. He was aiming for a type of perfection in his work. And he always felt at the end of each canvas, it's a little step forward. That's the comparison that usually constitutes winning, success within the artistic venue. The idea that one's work has progressed beyond the previous effort. That's one of the main reasons why great composers, great painters, great writers keep composing, keep painting, keep writing, because they themselves have a vision that they're chasing, a vision that they're pursuing. Beethoven remarked that, what he imagined, his goal, was always beyond his reach, but he kept pursuing it. Same thing with Van Gogh. We might imagine Van Gogh almost like laughing at people spending $100 million for individual canvases when none of them represented the full achievement of his vision. Each work, from Van Gogh's perspective, was falling short of what he was trying to achieve. But insofar as he could move further and further towards the realization of that vision, so that each work was progress relative to the work before, that represents, on the one hand, the measure of completion of the work. The work is typically not finished until one's had that sense of having progressed, and gives that sense of winning within that aesthetic realm, winning to a stronger result, a more successful result than the previous one. In the case of my pole works, every work has to achieve some new innovation, some step forward that I had not achieved previously for me to consider the work complete. And I've mentioned, I think in the past too, that in general, the test for me of completion is chills and tears. If I don't have a strong emotional reaction, then the work isn't done. It's not successful. It has not won through to the status of a finished work, finished for the purposes of that particular piece. And then I move on to the next, which has to represent an advance beyond it. And for me, again, the sign of that advance is an emotional reaction, chills and tears. If I don't get that, I'm not done, even if it seems to me that it's a successful work. So winning is a comparative process in the aesthetic realm when you're doing art, but it's a matter of a comparative evaluation of what one has done today versus what one has done yesterday, or this work versus the preceding work. And that sense of that process continuing from one work to the next, you find throughout the history of art. The great Italian or Venetian painter, Titian, the Renaissance, late Renaissance artist, would always sign his works Titian it was the Latin version of this, but the English translation is Titian was working on this. But he was working on it to a point of successful completion, a point of winning, to his aesthetic goal until the next work. It's characteristic of the artistic process and what sustains it, work to work. So, the notion of comparison, essential to winning, the notion of bringing something to at least a provisional end, central to the evaluation that constitutes winning versus losing in some enterprise. In the spiritual realm, what came to my mind in relation to this topic was the case of Ramakrishna. Ramakrishna was a 19th century Hindu mystic, guru, teacher. He inspired a lot of devotion. He reported from a young age mystical experiences of union with God, of experiencing divinity, like here and now, firsthand. That, again, is the goal of a mystical enterprise. Ramakrishna, in fact, said that the only point of religious undertaking was to achieve that experience of divinity here and now. That corresponds to the philosophic enterprise of achieving the rigor of epistemic space here and now, seeing the world rigorously, not heuristically. It relates to an aphorism of mine that I've given before. Eden is a landscape of philosophical rigor. So, and I've also emphasized that the rigor that philosophy achieves accomplishes what religions have aspired to metaphorically, in terms of belief or in terms of faith. So when one reads accounts, actually, of Ramakrishna's mystical experiences, one can give their logic in philosophic terms. But what I wanted to quote here, actually, were some words that were supposedly uttered at the time of Ramakrishna's death. And the words are, they all, this is from the people that were assembled, his disciples, they all thought it was ecstasy. And the disciples shouted victory. They felt that Ramakrishna had won at that moment of death. Now, did he win in that context, in that environment, in that Hindu set of beliefs and perspectives? Well, he won, in their thinking, release from the cycle of the endless cycle of birth, rebirth. He won through to, in terms of that Ramakrishna might put it, a final mystical but definitive union with God that transcended this process of successive rebirths. But notice that winning in that context deals with a termination of a process, right? So again, whenever we're talking about winning, even if we're talking about it within spiritual, mystical terms, there's still that heuristic understanding that frames it. There's the element of convergence and boundedness. And part of, in the case of aesthetic experience, that convergence is often, as I was saying just a moment ago, with one's previous efforts, but still a convergent process. The opposite, well, there are times when things don't come to an end, right? In any clear sense. We see that at play often in the aesthetic realm. We see that with we see that in the case of Stephen Crane. I was talking about Stephen Crane last week and his depiction of the fog of war, the lack of clarity about it. Like, you get the sense when you're reading Crane that it's not clear how things are going or where they are ending or when they are ending, right? So if there's no real clarity about endings or terminations, then there will be no assessment as to winning and losing. Same thing happens in the case of those legendary figures like Van Gogh, who in their lifetime were not successful, but after their death, their work, achieves universal acclaim and recognition. If the process were truncated, at Van Gogh's death, well, then we can assign winning or losing to it. But it's not truncated, or it wasn't truncated. And so it remains an open-ended process. And it's subject to reversals in the future, right? His his esteem can decline because of discoveries that might be made about his practice. That happened a little bit with Vermeer. But the point is that clarity of ending is essential for establishing a sense of winning and losing. Again, it's operating within a bounded space, a convergent space, where things can be summed, come together, like as total number of ballots cast, or number of runs scored, or comparative success of one effort relative to another, in aesthetic production. But it's a matter of bringing things together. It's a matter of making certain kinds of convergences, which are often comparisons. The alternative circumstance, the alternative reality, is the epistemic, right? The epistemic is a divergent space. The epistemic, the realm of philosophical rigor, is also the realm that achieves the logic of religious salvation. That's not a bounded space. That's not a bounded space, for one thing, because objects, which are convergent structures, don't exist within epistemic space. I told you that epistemic space is the space that we would see if we looked out on the world with new eyes. If it's the world that we see when we first open our eyes to the world, when it hasn't, the experiences haven't yet converged into objects and into patterns that we name and describe and live in terms of and anticipate future results in terms of. So, epistemic space is a divergent space. Things are never coming together, they are moving apart. So, the concept of winning, the concept of making comparisons that would allow for the assessment of winning or losing doesn't arise within that space. It's a space that preserves the essential dignity of each point that can't be compared to any other point, each object, each person that cannot be compared to any other person, because comparisons are bringing things together, are convergent processes. An epistemic space, by definition, is the opposite. So that's the space of freedom that Don Quixote ultimately occupies, that divergent space where comparisons are not ultimately justified, justifiable, or legitimate, not rigorously so. And in the end, when it comes to a matter of assessing the ultimate reality, well, it's that rigorous reality that stands. It stands in the face of all types of conjecture or belief or provisional claim. There's a summary of this towards the end of Phalaris's Bull, and I think I will recite that. Okay? It goes, to like only one song is not to like music. The solution to the world is our singular song. And what do we do to experience the solution to the world? First, realize that where you stand, no one has stood before. So it has applied to anyone need no longer apply. Every concept, including death, mortality. This is the epistemic, that each of us is the irreducible center of the world. It is the point of Einstein's physics. We exist in difference from everything else. The incontestable point of salvation, of freedom. And when in doubt, flip a coin. That in a world of time, you cannot know to the end of time that any possibility is not good. Equivalent from where we stand to a perfectly perfect world, an Eden, where every possibility is good. And to this world, the aphorisms are our guide. Aphorisms like, do not suffer that it ends. It was not redemption, because the process in principle does not end. Endings represent boundaries, and boundaries are characteristics of convergent space, heuristic space, not the ultimate reality of our circumstance, not epistemic space. Now, actually, I think we have a little bit more time. I was going to stop there, but I wanted to make a point in relation to freeing ourselves from this tyranny of the heuristic evaluation of outcomes. We often think of sports and of sports competitions as representing the ultimate arena for winning and losing. We look at races, we look at the Olympics, and we see, like swimmers in the pool, one swimmer, reaching the wall before the others, and that's the winner. Well, that's the winner in heuristic space. And it's the winner in heuristic space because those lanes in which all of those different competitors are swimming are approximately the same. But they're not exactly the same. Right? The turbulence in one lane is not necessarily exactly the same as the turbulence in another. The characteristics, the molecular characteristics of the water in one lane is not necessarily the same. The point is, these are differences that become exacting, right? They only operate at limits of rigor that we're never genuinely considering. But from the standpoint of philosophic evaluation, from the standpoint of winning and losing in life, they are vital to our assessment. From the standpoint of our reality ultimately being epistemic and not heuristic. So, gold medalist would boast, maybe, about his victories. Mark Spitz, the swimmer from the 1970s, who won 7 gold medals, was somewhat boastful. I know someone who knows him. He's something of an arrogant person. Well, and he has 7 gold medals, to show for it in 1 Olympics and 7 world records. But what he can't claim is that somebody else, any of the other swimmers, that in his place, in his lane, at the time he was swimming, if we could do the reversal, would not have done even better. He can't claim that because we can't ever do that type of experiment. Now, again, for the purpose of heuristic space, our normal evaluations of things, well, we don't worry about such details, such precisions, such rigors. But from the standpoint of rigorous assessment, evaluation, the ultimate claims that we can incontrovertibly make, that matters. And it pertains in every competition, no matter what. That the golfer, Tiger Woods, was occupying a certain place, at a certain time, with certain conditions of wind and humidity and temperature, and was making his shots under those exacting conditions. Every other golfer against which he was competing was in a slightly different set of conditions, a slightly different set of circumstances. And those differences can be in any instance decisive, and we can't ever know, because we can't ever go back in time to perform the experiment, to change positions and see what might happen. So we can't ever rise to a rigorous assertion of winning when we're dealing with epistemic space, rigorous space. And so individual human dignity survives any evaluative process that takes place within a heuristic, an approximate space. So no matter how somebody else has performed, you cannot ever know that where they were when they were carrying out that performance, you can't know that you wouldn't have done just as well or better. That's the nature of our world. That's the nature, ultimately, of human dignity, that everything is particular to circumstance, everything is singular, and ultimately, deeply, profoundly, comparisons are odious. No comparisons are rigorously possible. Okay, so I think that completes tonight's topic. Do we have any questions?
Thank you very much, Stephen, for the talks. We don't have any questions yet, but please, our friends, feel free to give your comments, your questions right now, and also after the session itself. But we do have a lot of thumbs up. Thank you very much, Diana, Eric Moss, and Hamza. Thank you very much. We see it all. We appreciate it all. And also, we have a comment from Gloria Miller. She's saying, the most appropriate type of daily life for me was a day-by-day world destruction. Peace was the most difficult and abnormal state to live in. Yukio Mishima.
Okay.
I think she's probably just sharing her experience, and maybe she's interested in your feedback regarding this quote. Thank you, Gloria. We will copy that and we will give our feedback. I mean, Mr. Stephen will give his feedback in the next session.
You know what I did want to do, maybe if we have a few minutes, let me just show, I have some photographs of some work that relates to points I made tonight. So if you can see, there's an image of a painting of Cervantes. That's the author of Don Quixote. He was the one who made that comment, comparisons are odious, are hateful, that framed the talk. Yes, Cervantes. Then, now this, I didn't send this to Aaliyah, but I just want to show you. I mentioned John Barryman. I don't know if you can, oh, let me. That is the face of John Barryman a little bit later in his life. That's the author of that essay, The Freedom of the Dawn, where he talked about the point of Don Quixote being freedom, the quest for freedom, which he thought was the subject, not just of Don Quixote, but of every work of art of which he had any knowledge. So that was John Berryman. I didn't mention Mindy Kaling. I showed you that. Oh, I mentioned Bertrand Russell. There's an image of Bertrand Russell. It's later in his life, but he lived to be 99. So most images are of later in his life, since he lived a very long life. He did write towards the end of his life that if it were offered to him to do it again, he would gladly live it over. So there was a life that was embraced. There is a sculpture of Pythagoras, the Greek mathematician, that said all is number. And again, the reason we can say that is because we're in a convergent space and numbers are convergences. Okay, there's Goethe. It's a painting of Goethe, the German writer, playwright, philosopher. I've referred to him a lot. Oh, and I mentioned Titian. Yes, that's Goethe, painting of Goethe. I also mentioned Titian, who always wrote on his canvases, Titian was working on this. Let me just, I don't know if you can see. Oops. That is I think it's a self-portrait actually of Titian. And one of the things about that is, that was one of the portraits, oh, there, okay. That was one of the portraits that I would look at every day when I was painting my early pastels, which are of people. So that type of work, and in fact, that particular work was an important influence upon my early art. Oh, and Ramakrishna. I mentioned Ramakrishna, the Hindu mystic. No, I guess. Let me just show you. It's a black and white photograph of the 19th century Hindu mystic Ramakrishna, whose death was seen as a victory. And I guess that, yeah. Yes, that's Ramakrishna. Remember, we all thought it was ecstasy, and the disciples shouted victory. One thing about Ramakrishna, let me just say, he in particular worshipped the Hindu goddess Kali. And there's a famous hymn to Kali. Thou, mother of blessings, thou, terrible night, night of delusion, night of death, we greet thee. So that was the Hindu deity, the Hindu goddess that Ramakrishna in particular embraced. So, yeah.
Super. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Stephen, for joining us weekly, for being our amazing speaker, for sharing all this information, pictures, and all your knowledge. We really appreciate it all. Thank you, friends, for joining us weekly. One more time, we would like to thank the U.S. Consulate General here in Almaty, American Space Almaty, and also you, Stephen, you, the audience, for joining us weekly. Please stay safe. You still have some minutes to give your comments and questions. We will address them next week. Stay safe and have a great day. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you, Aaliyah. And see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.